Hey everyone, Warwick's here. Welcome to the Monk Academy for the War Within. Quick overview on this series. What I'm going to do is I'm doing 3 videos for each spec. So 3 on Brewmaster, 3 on Mistweaver, 3 on Windwalker, in that order of alphabetical. And basically what I'm going to do is we're going to go into a very deep dive into Brewmaster Monk, Windwalker Monk, Mistweaver Monk for the War Within, diving into different aspects of each spec and the class as a whole. Quick disclaimers about these videos. These guides are intended for beginners. If you are an experienced Monk player, there's a very good chance that you will not actually gain a ton out of this video. That said, if you are an experienced Monk player and you did click on that, do appreciate you doing that. Share it with your friends that may be interested in playing Monk. I'd like to see this video get as much reach as humanly possible. So what we're going to do in each video, video 1, we're going to be talking about the spells and abilities. Now you might say, oh, that's just reading tooltips, but I'm hoping that I can help make some connections for you that you may miss. In video 2, we'll go into a deep dive of the talents, and then in video 3, we'll talk about rotation or healing priority in the case of Mistweaver, and then get an early look at things like stats and some tips and tricks that I've learned playing Monk over the last, 8 years or so now since season 4 of BFA. Now, these are not going to touch on anything like the hero talents or anything like that, and these are not really going to be intended as level 80 guides, because I am going to do more sort of quick guides at level 80. Once we get into the War Within, I'll probably try to make and release those right around the time before raid. So be on the lookout for those. If you're more interested in level 80 guides, those are going to come out probably in about, I'd say about 4 to 6 weeks from now. One other thing, these videos do go up on my Patreon first, so if you're interested in supporting me in another way other than this YouTube channel, of course you can sub to my Twitch stream, but I also do have a Patreon that I am slowly working on trying to make a viable platform for myself. These do go up there on first, and then will come to YouTube a few days later, so if you're interested in supporting me in another way, you can go up there. I technically have 2 tiers, but I only recommend that you do the $3 tier at this moment, because my higher tier, $5 tier, don't have any expanded reward ideas. Part of the process of building this, but I am putting them up there just so that I can have content on Patreon. So link for all that will be in the description below. So let's dive right in. Let's start with Brewmaster 101, spells and abilities. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with your passive abilities. Now, why am I starting with passive abilities? Because I do think that there are certain things that are very important about them. In particular case, there's a couple of them that are going to be vital for you to kind of understand what we're talking about when we start talking about some of your core abilities. Now, we're not going to go all of these because some of these are talent based, but there's 5 or 6 that I want to talk about specifically. And we're going to start with stagger. Now, stagger is the entire main sort of mechanic that Brewmaster Monk's defensive kit is entirely built around. So if you're not familiar or haven't figured out with Brewmaster Monk, it's class fantasy, or spec fantasy rather. It's heavily based off of a martial arts style called drunken boxing, where the practitioner is so fucking blitzed that they do not even feel pain, or they don't feel it until later. And that's what the idea here is that you are not necessarily going to be feeling all the pain, all the hurt of your attacks up front, but you will feel them consistently over time. And it's like one of those things where your adrenaline stops pumping, that's when you feel it all. That's kind of the idea. So stagger plays off of that idea. So basically what stagger does is there's 2 types of stagger. There's a physical damage stagger and a magical damage stagger, or magic stagger. All right. And these did get recently buffed, so hey, they're even better than what they are now. They scale based off of your agility. So the higher your item level, the higher your agility is, the more stagger that you are going to have. On a very basic level, what stagger does, and to use an example, is that if you take a hit for 100,000 damage, all right, all the other tanks will just lose 100,000 HP in their pool. Brewmaster does not. So what Brewmaster happens is, like, as an example, it will say take on 100,000 hit, it'll take 40,000 of that up front, and then 60,000 of that as a damage over time dot that ticks every second for 10 seconds. All right, so you're taking very consistent damage at take. You're not going to have periods where your health bar isn't moving at all. Your health bar is basically always moving when you're in active combat as a Brewmaster Monk, so it is something that you have to get used to. Magic damage, of course, as you can see here, affects magical attacks at 45% effectiveness. Basically what that means is that instead of taking 40,000 up front, you're going to take 55,000 up front and 45,000 over the course of the 10-second dot. So magic damage is definitely still dangerous. That's a targeted very purposeful design choice by Blizzard. They want all tanks to be susceptible to magic damage in some form or fashion, with different tanks having different levels of strength against it. Brewmaster Monk staggers are a very powerful mechanic. It's not tuned well. It can make Brewmaster very broken, or it can make Brewmaster very weak. We'll see how this plays out over the course of the early War Within expansion, but right now my understanding is that it's tuned pretty well. So it's not overpowered, but it's not bad. Almost your entire defensive kit and some of your offensive abilities even interact with stagger. So this is a very important item to track. Now, there is right here in the default UI, there is a stagger bar that is there, but I'm going to recommend that you get some sort of weak aura. I have a weak aura package here that allows me to do that. And right here will track my stagger bar. Because stagger is something that plays off of some of your main defensive abilities and it impacts your thing. Now you can also see here a second paragraph in the stagger tooltip is that you do gain 15% mastery based on your current level of stagger. So if you're sitting at one of the 3 forms of stagger, you'll gain additional mastery out of that. There's low stagger, which is usually identified as green. There's medium stagger, which is identified as yellow. And then there's high stagger, which is identified as red. So very much a stoplight situation there. So stagger, very, very important. You do need to keep track of it. You do need to know what it's doing for you. You need to know what your stagger levels are at because it's going to determine a lot of your damage intake. So it is very, very important that you do so. Next up, we're going to talk about Shuffle. So Shuffle is got a little bit of a weird history. It was a former active ability that got baked into a passive and renamed. So basically what Shuffle does is it increases the effectiveness of your stagger by 100%. And how do you gain Shuffle? You do your core rotation. Keg Smash, Blackout Kick, and Spinning Crane Kick all give you Shuffle. Varying durations on that depending on the ability. So basically, if you're playing your core rotation correctly, you're always going to have this buff up. This means that you don't necessarily need to track this buff. This is not something that you necessarily have to go out of your way to micromanage. This is just something that you need to be aware of that you're having it. And as long as you're playing that rotation correctly, you should have this up all the time during active combat. Next up is going to be the Mastery, Elusive Brawler. So Elusive Brawler is our mastery. Basically, each time you're hit with a melee attack or hit with Blackout Kick, you gain X amount of percent increased dodge chance until your next successful dodge. Of course, mine's around 29% currently. And then, of course, you get an attack power increase that is also a 1-to-1 conversion. So I'm getting close to 29% extra attack power. The extra AP is just something that comes with all the tank specs. So don't be surprised if you see that on any tank spec that you're playing. Elusive Brawler is a pretty good mastery, I think. It does give that extra percent, extra opportunity to dodge, which sometimes you can micromanage it to where you're avoiding big tank hits. It's very finicky to do that, but it is something that you can do. Generally speaking, this is something that, again, be aware of what it's doing for you, but it's not something that you have to actively go out of your way and track unless you really want to, because you're a nerd like me. Next up, Spirit of the Ox. This is, technically it's a talent, but it is a very important passive. That's why we're mentioning it here. So basically, Rising Sun Kick and Blackout Kick have a chance to summon a healing sphere. You'll see this is actually goes into the game field. It is a gold orb that goes around your character, or it just spreads out over the course of the field. And then you can use different abilities to actually get healing from those spheres. And of course, mine heal for about 87-ish thousand. And there are different ways to interact with these spheres. You can walk over them. Spinning Crane Kick will slowly move them in closer to you. And then a talent like Expel Harm will just absorb them all up front and do a big burst of healing. So Spirit of the Ox, very important to the sustain aspect, the healing sustain aspect of Brewmaster Monk, because Brewmaster Monk doesn't have a lot of sustain options built into the kit. So this is one that's very important. Again, it's good to know how many you get, because I think you get a maximum of 5 before they just automatically heal you and a new one spawns onto the field. But not necessarily something that you have to track a ton. And a lot of weak aura packages, if you're using them, will actually track the number of orbs you have out on your Expel Harm button. So good to know, probably a good idea to track, but I wouldn't say it's mandatory to track like Stagger is. All right, rest of these are all passives that are in the talent tree build. So we're going to talk about those when we go over the talent tree in the next video. The last two that I want to talk about here are Celestial Fortune. You have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to be healed for an additional 80% of the amount healed. I think this is going to get changed to 70% here soon, so just be aware that that's going to get nerfed a little bit. So to use our 100,000 damage example, say a paladin or a priest heals you for 100,000, you have a chance equal to your crit strike chance to actually be healed for 180,000. This makes crit a pretty valuable stat for Brewmaster Monk. It's one of the few tanks, if for a while it was the only tank, but one of the few tanks that actually values critical strike as a secondary stat. So again, not something that you need to track, not something you need to be aware of. You'll see it show up on your like details meters with all the healing that you do, but I wouldn't say it's something that you need to be aware of. Just know that this is something that you have going for you, which is why some of your heals are going to hit a lot harder than others do. It's because the Celestial Fortune proc is happening. And finally, Brewmaster Balance. This is also getting buffed. Your armor is increased by 25%. This is now getting buffed to 50%. And your stamina is being increased by 45%. So more armor, more HP. Now, Brewmaster Monk, in comparison to other tanks, has the lowest HP pool, but because of the way stagger works, which makes your damage intake much more smooth, your effective health pool is, generally speaking, among the highest. Now, what is effective health? Basically, it's a nerdy math calculation to determine actually how much HP you have over the course of a fight. It's not something that as a beginner you need to worry about, but just know that your HP pool actually stretches a lot farther than the number that you see on the screen. I'm at 2.12 million right now. In reality, my health pool is much bigger than that, but the number on your unit frames does not reflect that number. So those are your main passives that you need to be focused on. Again, stagger is the most important one, but the other ones are just good to know that you have these affecting you, and then we go from there. Now let's go into your core offensive abilities, and we're going to start with Keg Smash, which I think is the kind of iconic Brewmaster Monk ability. Here, basically, you smash a keg of brew on your target. It deals physical damage to all enemies within 8 yards and reduces their movement speed by 20% for 15 seconds. The movement speed reduction is not super important. It's niche use in like dungeon scenarios, but for the most part, it's just kind of whatever. And then, of course, deals reduced damage among 5 targets. That's just Blizzard's way of controlling the damage. Gives you 5 seconds of shuffle, passive we mentioned earlier, and reduces the main cooldown on your brews by 3 seconds. So we'll talk about your brews and your defensive abilities, but this is really, really important. Keg Smash is the most important ability that you press offensively, and it does so much. Now, the other thing is that Keg Smash will leave a debuff on your target that is impacted by another ability, which we're going to talk about in just a second, so be mindful of that. So with Keg Smash, my recommendation is that you put it in your most comfortable keybind. You're going to hit it a lot. Like every time it comes off cooldown, you should be hitting it. Now, there are abilities that will give it 2 charges, or you'll get, obviously you can see that it's a little bit of a hasted cooldown, even though Brewmaster Monk is not the biggest fan of haste. Just know that you're going to be hitting this button a ton. That's all you need to know. Next up, Breath of Fire. Breath of Fire breathes fire into target, causing 20,000 in case it's just a percentage of damage is fire damage, and deals reduced damage to secondary targets. Targets affected by the Keg Smash debuff will also take an additional tick of fire damage over time and do 5% reduced damage to you. So a good rule of thumb with Breath of Fire is that if you have not Keg Smashed a target, do not Breath of Fire them. You lose so much value by Breath of Firing a target that does not have the Keg Smash debuff on it. And with a 15-second flat cooldown, it can sometimes feel like an eon before you actually have this ability to get back up. So the damage over time, there's been tier sets that interact with the damage over time aspect, so it's obviously something that can be very, very important to the Brewmaster kit. The 5% damage reduction for 12 seconds, obviously you see it's a 15-second cooldown, but a 12-second duration on that debuff. So it's not designed to be up 100% of the time, but there's ways to get around that. This is a very, very important ability. I would put it right next to your Breath of Fire keybind, or your Keg Smash keybind, because you're basically going to Keg Smash and Breath of Fire. It's going to be a very common way for you to play the spec early on. Next up, let's talk over here about Tiger Palm. Tiger Palm is your general monk filler ability. So this is basically going to be used when you don't really have anything else going on. Deals just physical damage, and then of course it also reduces your brew's cooldown by 1 second. So you get 3 seconds off with Keg Smash, and then you're getting 1 second off with Tiger Palm. So your brew cooldowns, which we'll talk about in a little bit, very vital to kind of maintaining your stagger and balancing your stagger levels out as best as possible. So knowing that these abilities have that interaction, again, good to know, but not necessarily something that you hyper focus on. Let's also talk about Blackout Kick. Blackout Kick, very simple ability. You press it, it does damage, it has a short cooldown, gives you shuffle for 3 seconds. Very, very good ability. Now there are talents that will set up to make Blackout Kick even more powerful, but we'll talk about those in the next video. But just know Blackout Kick, very important ability. Generally speaking, you're going to be hitting it if you don't have a Keg Smash or Breath of Fire going. Blackout Kick is generally a safe pick to pick in that option as we start to see a rotation priority start to form here as we go over these abilities. Let's also talk about Spinning Crane Kick. Spinning Crane Kick is the spin to win button. I think most people that have watched any monk play, you know, if you see them spinning around, this is the ability that they're using. So deals damage over to all enemies within 8 yards of the monk. Does damage over time. It's a quick little channel ability. And then also grants shuffle. And then your healing spheres from Gift of the Ox will also move towards you, as I mentioned earlier. So really spinning Crank Kick is going to be only used in multi-target scenarios. And I would even argue it's not really useful until about 3 to 4 targets are being faced. It's the other, what I like to dub the other filler ability. So you Tiger Palm in like 1 to 2 target situations, spinning Crank Kick in more than 2 target situations. And finally, Rising Sun Kick. Rising Sun Kick, short cooldown, he just deals big old single target physical damage, and it does have interactions with other aspects of your kit, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or in the talent videos and in the tips and tricks video. So Rising Sun Kick, not an ability that I think is a main priority damage, especially in AoE situations, but it is good to always kind of push as much on cooldown as you can, because I mean, 140,000 baseline damage at my item level, that's a pretty big amount, and it's really good for like single target threat generation, things of that nature. So I say these right here are your core offensive abilities that you want to have comfortable keybinds for, because you will use them a lot. Let's move on to your core defensive abilities. We're going to start with Purifying Brew. So Purifying Brew is one of 2 main brews that you have, and then you have your cooldown brews to go along with that. So Purifying Brew clears 50% of the damage that you've delayed with Stagger. So you can see here, this is the first ability that we're watching that really interacts with your Stagger bar. So Purifying Brew takes, like, so as an example, you take that 60,000 damage over time on a physical hit, you hit a Purifying Brew immediately, it's going to just remove and get rid of 30,000 damage of that. And so you're only going to take 30,000 damage over the course. So Purifying Brew, a very powerful ability. It is your main active mitigation tool. Stagger is your main passive mitigation tool. Purifying Brew, one of your main active mitigation tools. What I mean by active mitigation is it's a button that you press to give yourself more defensiveness. And it's one that you, in the case of active mitigation, it's a button that you press fairly consistently. As you can see, an 18-second recharge, but between the Keg Smash reduction, Tiger Palm reduction, and there's talents that also reduce its cooldown, that 18-second number is really a misnomer. You're generally getting it closer down to like 8 to 10 seconds. Of course, it has 2 charges as well, and it will also, through a talent that I have, heal for 25% of the damage cleared. That's a talent that's in there that gets added to the tooltip. We'll talk about that talent in the next video. The other main brew is Celestial Brew. Basically what this does is that every time you do a Purifying Brew, you actually are building up this Celestial Brew. So this basically gives you a big old absorb shield, and the more damage that you purify, more stagger that you purify, the bigger the shield. I've gotten shields that have been basically my entire health pool. So fun. We like that. So Celestial Brew is a really good way to give you a way to react to a big hit. It's also very useful to like do pre-damage events, so that most of the damage of a big tank buster ability or a big boss ability gets absorbed by the Celestial Brew shield. So there's just a lot of good ways that Celestial Brew comes into play. On a 45-second cooldown, again with your stagger reductions, it's closer to 30 seconds. So you have this up pretty often. Generally speaking, I would recommend hitting this as often as you can, because more shields is better than bigger but less frequent shields. This is your second form of active mitigation. So this is an ability that you'll be pressing a lot. So again, Purifying Brew, Celestial Brew, put them on comfortable keybinds because you're going to be using them quite a bit. All right, let's talk about your main big cooldown, and that is Fortifying Brew, which is your third core defensive ability in my opinion. This is a long cooldown at 6 minutes, but again, through your brew reduction, it's going to be closer to around 4. But basically, it gives you a big boost to your health, big damage reduction, and it's just a really good, powerful cooldown. You don't want to use this obviously to like without really a good reason to. So it is a like more of a bigger defensive cooldown, but it is one that you are going to want to pay attention to. All right, let's talk about your cooldowns. So this is going to cover both offensive and defensive cooldowns. Some of these kind of get mixed into a core rotation. Some of these are going to be just kind of useful abilities. Let's start with Exploding Keg. Exploding Keg is a talent that you get towards the bottom of your tree that basically has a 1 minute cooldown. You hurl a keg at your target's feet. That's fire damage. and then you deal a little bit of extra fire damage as you attack them, and it gives them 100% reduced damage for the next 3 seconds. So while that keg smash debuff is up, or exploding keg debuff is up, really, you are taking no damage. One of the few times that your HP pool won't move. This is a very powerful ability. It does a ton of damage. It is great for grabbing threat. It is great for giving you a little bit of a defensive boost early in a pull so that everyone else can do more damage. And then it also does that good damage over time effect when you have these other attacks that are rolling. Exploding Keg, very, very good. Rushing Jade Wind. Rushing Jade Wind, a very short cooldown ability. You press it often. I put it in a very comfortable keybind for myself as well. But basically, you just summon a whirling tornado around you that does damage over time, and then just reduce damage over a number of targets. This ability has a little bit of controversy because some people really like it, some people really hate it. It doesn't really have a middle ground. I'm a big fan of Rushing Jade Wind, so I like when it's good. It is on a choice node in the talent tree, so we'll talk about that later. So you may not always have this ability, but if it is the one that works out for you or you prefer it, just know you're going to be pressing it often. It kind of falls into a weird mix of a cooldown, but also a core damage ability because it's consistent damage that you're always doing to a target. So even if you have like a couple of GCDs where you don't have any attacks that you can do, you're still always doing damage, always trying to maintain that threat. All right. Weapons of Order. This is the old Shadowlands Covenant ability. It is still around, still kicking. Basically, it takes you for the next 30 seconds, gives you a 10% mastery boost, resets the cooldown of Keg Smash, and then enemies that are hit by Keg Smash or Rising Sun Kick take increased damage to you by stacking up to 4 times, so it's up to 32% increased damage. Now, adding a stack does not refresh the timer, so you're kind of pushing everything inside the window. This is a pretty powerful cooldown. You generally want to use it on cooldown if you can. Anytime you are making a pull, just use it. Because you get the extra 10% mastery, which means more elusive brawler chances, which means higher AP, which means more general damage. It's just a good cooldown. Very simple fire and forget ability. You don't have to do anything special with it. All right. I think that covers everything from, Zen Meditation. Zen Meditation, a big cooldown. It's a very interesting cooldown. It's kind of finicky at times. Basically, you reduce all damage taken by 60% for 8 seconds, but hit being by a melee attack, taking another action, or in some cases moving, will actually break this effect. So what I recommend is that if you know there's a big tank buster coming up, you plant your feet, you hit Zen Meditation, you let it go until the hit happens, and then you cancel it and immediately go back into your rotation. Can be a very powerful cooldown, can really mitigate big tank buster mechanics. So again, an ability that I would put somewhere that you know where you can access it, but not something that I'd be pressing a ton. It's kind of a little bit more niche use compared to like Fortifying Brew or even Celestial Brew. But still, good ability. It's always good to have. You can't have too many defensive buttons. Dampen Harm. Dampen Harm is a defensive talent that you can choose. It's on a choice node with a passive ability, so you may not always have this. It really depends on mostly dungeon and raid tuning. Basically what it does is it reduces damage by 20 to 50% for 10 seconds based on the amount of damage that you're taking at that time. So it's a little bit of an unpredictable cooldown, but I mean still a baseline 20% damage reduction to as much as 50% on a 2-minute cooldown. Still pretty good. And then finally there's Diffuse Magic. Diffuse Magic, 1.5 minute cooldown, reduces magic damage you take by 60% for 6 seconds and transferred all currently active harmful effects back onto the original caster if possible. The big thing for most beginners is that you know you're getting a 60% damage reduction from magic damage, which you're already a little bit more susceptible to, so a good cooldown. Now, the transferring harmful effects back onto the caster, that is mostly a PvP thing, but there are some cases where you can remove damage over time effects off of you from a mob. I think of, for example, in Algathar Academy, Veximus, the elemental boss, has those arcane orbs that he summons. If you stack 2 or 3 of those, you can diffuse the dot off and take no damage from the dot. Now, in the case of PvE situations, generally speaking, you're not going to reflect that dot back onto a boss. That rarely happens, but it does allow you to remove some dot effects. There's always a list that somebody goes through and makes. I wouldn't stress too much about it. Just know that if you have this button, you can use it when you know you've got a big damage magic damage event coming in, and help reduce some of that damage. All right, Touch of Death. Touch of Death, 1.5 minute cooldown. Basically, when you get a target into execute range for this, I think for Brewmaster Monk it's under 10%, or for Monk in general it's under 10%. You basically instantly kill them. Now, for what happens with Monk is that it's or usable on creatures less health than you. There's a talent that makes it just usable at 15%. That it kind of depends on build whether or not you take it. So for Brewmaster Monk, because you have, like right now I have 2 million health, as soon as a mob gets under 2 million health, you can hit Touch of Death and it kills them off. Now for Brewmaster Monk, Touch of Death will also basically clear 200% of your stagger. So it's almost virtually an entire stagger removal in almost every situation. Very rarely have I had it not completely clear my stagger bar. So if you're in a big pull, you can always Touch of Death snipe a mob to clear your stagger health. If you're at high stagger and you're starting to bleed out and from too much damage, this is a good way to reset that stagger bar, allow you to balance out your damage intake so that your healer can catch up. Very, very good cooldown. Always good to use at any given moment. All right, let's talk about some of your utility abilities. And let's start with your mobility ones. So we have Transcendence. Transcendence has kind of gotten a little bit of a facelift. It does quite a bit for Brewmaster Monk now. You split your body and your spirit, leaving your spirit behind for 15 minutes, and then you use Transcendence Transfer to swap to your location. So basically what this does is that when you use this button, so I have it here, you use this button, you place a target. Now you can run away from this. Now there is a range on it. Like you see right now I'm out of range. Well, you can see I'm right here out the other side of this circle. This is a 2-button thing, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. You have Transcendence and then Transcendence Transcendent Transfer. If you hit Transfer, your body and your spirit trade places. This is very useful for mobility. There's a lot of different ways to use Transcendence. In fact, if you're still in pre-patch playing Season 4 Dragonflight Dungeons, I actually did 2 whole videos on how to use Transcendence in those dungeons. Go check that out. And I will probably do this again for the War Within dungeons once we start to figure out all the good Transcendence tech. And then I'm going to add doing Transcendence in Raid, because there's always some good Transcendence tech in Raid that you can use as well. So Transcendence is very, very good. There's a bunch of talents that actually interact with it down here in the bottom part of the tree. So very, very good, very fun ability to use. Allows you to keep uptime on your DPS, allows you to maybe stay just an extra second or 2 longer in a boss mechanic before you just Transcendence out to avoid taking the damage that could one-shot you. Things like that. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do with Transcendence that really can make your life easier. Roll. This is your kind of iconic monk ability. So you roll a short distance, you get right there. Now, roll does have some other things that go on with it. Of course, there's some talent builds that now interact with roll. Roll is becoming a much more flavorful part of the kit. I get max 3 charges, you get 2 baseline, and then there's a talent that gives you a 3rd one. Makes you very mobile in combat over short distances, and it can even add up to being decent mobility over long distances. It's a very, very nice ability to have. Definitely recommend putting it on a good keybind, because you can use it to dodge out of mechanics, use it to roll out of mechanics, roll back in after a mechanic happens, cut the travel time down between packs in tanking situations. Really, really fun ability, really flavorful ability. I love roll. It's wonderful. And this is kind of a mixture between pure utility and mobility, and that's Tiger's Lust. Basically, you can increase your speed or give it to a party member and increase their movement speed by 70% for 6 seconds, and then you remove all roots and snares. That's the utility part of it, but it does have mobility. So again, if you're out of roll charges and you need to move out of an ability, you can always Tiger's Lust yourself, get that extra movement speed, get out of dodge, or get back in very effectively. There are abilities that, like for example, Entangled, which is going to be soon dying a wonderful death as an affix. You can Tiger's Lust affix off of you. If there's something that puts a slow on you, I'm thinking Chronolord Dios and Oldemon of Tyr, his time sync ability. You can Tiger's Lust that debuff off, because it's considered a snare. So, very good one. Again, 30-second cooldown, so it's up somewhat often. I would say if you need a quick burst of speed, this is a good way to do it, especially if you don't have any roll charges. Now let's talk about some other sort of general abilities that you have here. So let's start with Expel Harm. This is another one that's kind of utility, kind of offensive, kind of defensive. So I'm kind of putting it here because it just does a little bit of everything. So Expel Harm for Brewmaster Monk, basically you heal for a little bit and then you deal damage back as nature damage to enemies within 20 yards of you. This also is used to draw in all your healing spheres from Gift of the Ox, which increases the amount of healing that you do. And then of course that means you're doing damage back. So it's a both sustain button and an offensive button, but also has utility because it's a way for you to have like almost like a lay on hands effect with Gift of the Ox Orb. So like really good button to have. Again, put it in a comfortable location. Leg sweep. Leg sweep is a baseline minute cooldown that basically in an arc in front of, in a cone in front of you like this, you know, like cone like that, will knock enemies down, stunning them for 3 seconds. It's really good as an interrupt tool. If you have abilities that aren't kickable but can be stunned off, you can use leg sweep to stun them off. Or if there's a multiple cast going off and you've got bad kick rotation from your party members or whatever the case may be, you can just use leg sweep to stop that. And because it stuns them, it's also just a good way to stop damage for 3 seconds. Maybe let your healer catch up. Very, very good ability. Very, very valuable in dungeon scenarios. Less valuable in raid scenarios because it's a lot more niche in its use. But there's, I mean, you get it baseline, so you always have leg sweep in some form or fashion. So there's always a way to find a good use for it. Paralysis. This actually got a change where paralysis will actually just do it's a single target CC stun. So it's a 20-yard range, 30-second cooldown. Paralyzes, incapacitates a target for a minute. So it's very good as like a single target CC. With a talent build, it actually also will do a soothe effect, which removes an enrage effect from targets. So again, an enrage effect I'm thinking of is Rage Storm, which the trash mobs in Breckenhide Hollow do that do the big old whirlwind. That's actually an enrage effect. Anything that has a soothe, so a Hunter Trank Shot, a Druid Soothe, and now Monk Paralysis can just stop that ability because it's a soothe effect. So very good at single target CC, and now has even more flexible use as we move into the War Within, because you now can use it to stop these enrage effects, which there are some that happen across all of the dungeons. Ring of Peace, very good CC and mobility option here. You basically throw this on the ground, as you can see here, and basically if an enemy is standing inside of this, they will get bounced to the outside of the ring. So if there's a mob that has like a focus onto like your healer, you can drop a Ring of Peace on your healer. Healer can stand in the middle of it, and that mob that is tunnel visioning them will not ever reach them. It's also very good for really like interrupting attacks as well. Like there is some tech where people will place a Ring of Peace fairly close to a wall, and just the mob continually bounces off the wall and off the Ring of Peace while it's there, making it do 0 attacks because it's a knockback in that case. So very, very good ability. Really, really useful in Mythic Plus. Again, in raid situations, a lot more niche, but it just opens up pathing down the tree, so it's a really good ability to have all the time. Spearhand Strike, that is your interrupt. So every character, with the exception of certain priests, have an interrupt of some kind. In this case, you get Spearhand Strike, which basically stops spellcasting from happening. It's on a 15-second cooldown. It does have some talent that interact with it. Basically, this is good for stopping abilities from being cast in really dungeon scenarios and in trash scenarios in raids. There are some bosses that also do have interrupt mechanics in them, and so you work off of that. Generally speaking, you will work around your raid for that. Provoke is your taunt. If that Ret Paladin or that Hunter pulls the mob too early, you target them, push Provoke, that mob comes right back to you. Good way to keep your friends safe, make sure a mob is focusing onto you. I've had situations where even I've been taunting basically as soon as it comes off of cooldown in raid situations when I know I need to be tanking for an extended amount of time. So that really hits on a lot of these. You have a couple of things. Zen Pilgrimage takes you back to your home temple. This takes you up to Tiger's Peak in this case, which was for a while a very important part of the story. This is more flavor at this point than anything else. Same with Zen Flight, just a little flavorful thing that has some fun use here. You can see I'm up on this cloud now. You can float. You move very slowly, so this is not like an alternative to flying or anything like that. So just again, a fun little flavorful thing. If you're sitting around waiting for like someone to come to the dungeon, or you're discussing strategy on a pool, I usually would just, pop a Zen Flight real quick just to have some fun, sit down on it, and chill. And finally, Vivify. Vivify is your just basic heal. You're a hybrid class, you have a heal. You heal this on yourself. It costs 30 energy for you, not any mana, because Brewmaster doesn't have mana. So just a good way to, like, if you're leveling and you happen to get low somehow, good way to throw a heal on yourself. If you're not able to attack a mob, a good way to just throw an extra heal out on your party members, help out your healer a little bit. You'll find uses to use Vivify. Generally speaking, you won't. And then this really niche ability, Crackling Jade Lightning, most of the time you're only going to use it to pull a mob, but then you're better off just running in and keg smashing. So I don't really see a use for Crackling Jade Lightning. You get it baseline. There are some talents that interact with it, but I don't see a value. And then our last major ability is Resuscitate, which is just our res. So it's not as good as Mass Res because it has a range. Mass Res is 100 yards. This is 40. But if your healer's dead and there's no one else to res, you can res. So avoid your healer from making that run back. So that is a breakdown of Brewmaster spells and abilities. Like I said, we didn't touch on all the passives because I'm going to go into the talent tree about a lot of these that talk about these. But that's Brewmaster 101. So congratulations, class. You've made it through your first lesson. If there's any questions that you have, you can always put them down in the comments. I go in and I read as many comments as I can every day. I will answer as many questions as I can. And if you are still kind of worried about, like, what do these abilities do, don't worry. We'll get into a rotation here in a little bit. But really, I wanted you to kind of look at the abilities, understand which ones are core, which ones are niche, which ones are utility, which ones are mobility. And hopefully I made some connections for you into kind of how this kit works. So congratulations, class. You are dismissed from Brewmaster 101 spells and abilities. Next class, we will be doing Brewmaster 102 talent trees. Until the next video, hope you stay safe. Hope you enjoy yourself. You're having fun. You keep on gaming. We'll see you all in the next video.